We know the story of Caligula, the mad emperor, the tyrant who declared war on the sea, who appointed his horse as consul, whose name has become synonymous with insane, arbitrary cruelty. He is a caricature, a monster from a history book. His reign a 4-year aberration in the grand narrative of Rome. His sexual deviance is often lumped in with his madness, a chaotic frenzy of incest and perversion, the random impulses of a mind unhinged. But history is rarely so simple. To dismiss Caligula as merely insane is to miss the far more terrifying truth. What if his actions were not random, but chillingly deliberate? What if his sexual violence was not a symptom of madness, but a calculated, systematic weapon? This is not a story of one man's descent into depravity. This is the story of how sexual terror was engineered into a tool of absolute control. This is the systematic sexual terror of Rome's mad emperor. The popular myth of Caligula's madness provides a comfortable distance. It allows us to categorize him as an outlier, a freak of nature. But the archaeological and historical evidence points to a different reality. This was not chaos. It was a cold, bureaucratic nightmare. The accounts of historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, often read as salacious gossip, reveal a pattern so consistent it becomes a methodology. The discovery of the Palatine Hill complex, with its interconnected rooms and private chambers, speaks to an architecture of control designed not for pleasure, but for observation and isolation. To understand the system, we must first look past the insanity and see the strategy. Caligula's reign began with immense public goodwill, but his true nature emerged not as a sudden breakdown, but as a phased implementation of terror. His initial targets were not random citizens, but the very heart of the Roman elite, the wives and daughters of senators. This was a deliberate first strike. He would publicly announce his intention to bed a senator's wife, then force the husband to be present, or even to facilitate the encounter. The goal was not merely sexual gratification. It was the complete dismantling of the Roman patriarch's dignity, demonstrating that no family, no matter how noble, was beyond his reach. This was the foundational principle of his system, to make the entire ruling class complicit in their own humiliation. This practice evolved into a more sophisticated and insidious form of psychological warfare, moving beyond individual humiliation to attack the very spiritual foundations of Roman society. Caligula began systematically pairing sexual acts with sacred rituals, creating a blasphemous fusion of the profane and the divine, designed to shatter the most deeply held Roman societal taboos. He understood that to truly break a person's spirit, one must violate not just their body but their soul. To this end, he orchestrated ceremonies that perverted state religion. High-ranking matrons, the very embodiments of Roman virtue and family honor, were forced to participate in rituals where they were first worshipped as living goddesses, draped in the vestments of Venus or Diana, only to be violently stripped of that divinity moments later and subjected to grotesquely degrading sexual acts. This deliberate juxtaposition was a masterstroke of psychological torture. The initial elevation made the subsequent violation not just a physical attack, but a spiritual annihilation. The historian Philo of Alexandria, part of a Jewish delegation that witnessed Caligula's behavior firsthand, described a ruler who observed these spectacles not with rabid lust, but with the chilling detachment of a scientist. He took meticulous notes on the participants' reactions, the exact moment a senator's face crumpled as he watched his wife be degraded, the silent scream of a priest forced to sanctify the act. Caligula was studying their breaking points, conducting live field research in the limits of human endurance. This was not the erratic behavior of a madman. It was the calculated methodology of a sadist engineering a new science of control. The system's most horrific aspect, however, was its ruthless institutionalization within the imperial family itself. The treatment of his sisters, particularly Drusilla, transcended simple incest. It was a calculated, cold-blooded weaponization of the most fundamental human bonds. Caligula, demonstrating a terrifying understanding of environmental psychology, first redesigned the imperial residence on the Palatine Hill. He ordered the removal of walls and doors between his chambers and those of his sisters, transforming the domestic space into a panopticon of abuse, a place where privacy was impossible and surveillance was constant. This architectural overhaul created an environment of perpetual vulnerability. Then he elevated them to divine status, forcing a terrified Senate to decree their official worship as goddesses. The message was unequivocal. Even the most sacred relationships, sibling loyalty, familial love, were now mere instruments of imperial power. The sexual corruption of his own household was a public demonstration that no bond, no matter how primal or protected by tradition, was inviolable. He would summon all three sisters simultaneously, forcing them to witness each other's humiliation, systematically destroying the trust between them to ensure they could never form a united front against him. In Drusilla, he found his primary subject, and after her untimely death his grief was not for a beloved sister, but for the loss of his most refined experimental specimen. His subsequent search for women who resembled her was an attempt to replicate a complex psychological experiment he could never fully recreate. This system of control reached its apotheosis in what can only be described as state-sponsored sexual terrorism, designed to implicate the entire population of Rome in his madness. Caligula transformed public spectacles, like the gladiatorial games at the Circus Maximus, into vast open-air theaters of mass humiliation. The games were a core pillar of Roman identity, a sacred expression of military virtue and civic pride. He perverted them utterly. In the midst of a contest, he would halt the action and, from his imperial box, randomly summon noblewomen from the audience. They were forced to serve as attendants, a transparent euphemism for sexual servitude, in front of their husbands, children, and the entire city. The purpose was to normalize the terror, to make every citizen a silent witness and thus a complicit accomplice. The trauma was no longer confined to palace walls. It was broadcast to the mob, corrupting the very fabric of public life. Simultaneously, the imperial palace itself was converted into a grimly efficient processing center. Suetonius records a dedicated wing, a kind of administrative hell, where women were not merely held but catalogued. They were categorized by their family connections, their social status, and their perceived psychological resilience. This was not a traditional harem for pleasure. It was a laboratory, a pool of human subjects for his ongoing experiments. The system developed a bureaucracy of horror. Meticulous records were kept of victims' backgrounds, their reactions to specific forms of degradation, and the efficacy of various techniques. This meticulous record-keeping is perhaps the most compelling evidence of a systematic, calculated effort, a chilling precursor to the bureaucratic atrocities of the modern era. The goal was the complete psychological subjugation of the Roman elite, and Caligula approached it with the cold precision of a general waging a war on the human psyche. The legacy of this systematic terror outlasted Caligula's brief reign by decades, a poison in the bloodstream of the empire. When the Praetorian Guard assassinated him in 41 AD, they did not just kill a tyrant, they attempted to surgically remove a cancerous system. The subsequent emperor, Claudius, understood that the damage was not merely political but cultural. He went to great lengths to publicly destroy Caligula's records, purge his most loyal enforcers, and loudly restore traditional Roman values. This was an implicit acknowledgement of the profound cultural sickness his nephew had engineered, a sickness that required a deliberate public detoxification. The archaeological record on the Palatine Hill silently corroborates this. There is evidence of deliberate reconfiguration in the imperial living quarters after Caligula's death. Walls were rebuilt, doors were reinstalled, and spaces were reconfigured in an attempt to erase the architectural blueprint of his terror. They were trying to rebuild not just rooms, but a sense of psychological safety. The story of Caligula, therefore, forces us to confront an uncomfortable and enduring truth. The greatest threat to a society may not be the chaotic raving madman, but the cold, systematic architect of terror, who understands that the most effective way to control a population is not through the fear of death, but through the systematic destruction of their dignity, their families, and their most sacred bonds. His reign stands as a dark testament to the fact that true evil is not always irrational. Sometimes it is meticulously, horrifyingly planned. The ruins of the Palatine Hill are not just stones. They are the silent witnesses to a system designed to break the human spirit. They caution us that when power is divorced from all morality, it does not always manifest as wild chaos, but can instead construct a machine of suffering so efficient that its echoes demand our vigilance across the ages.